Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of CUPE Cast. Are you hoping to learn more about unions or progressive movements? Then you're in the right spot. My name is Brianna Plummer, and I use she, her pronouns. We're the only podcast of our kind combining union info, pop culture, and more. Kicking ass for the working class, one podcast at a time. Whether you're a member of CUPE, in a union, wish you were in a union, or found us while browsing, then you're definitely in the right place. To hear more episodes, look for the CUPE Cast anywhere you stream or download podcasts. And for feedback for future episode ideas, don't forget you can always email us at cupecast@cupe.on.ca. That's CUPECAST@cupe.on.ca.
And I'm Moal Qasim. So, after months of rumors about the provincial election in early 2025, eligible voters in Ontario are heading to the polls on Thursday, February 27, 2025, to elect the next provincial government. With the Progressive Conservative sights on forming another majority government, the opposition parties are now on the offensive to ensure another Conservative government is not formed in Ontario. With the provincial election just days away, today's episode will dive into why this election is happening, what Labor's stance is on the election, and what provincial related issues affect CUPE members. We hope you are ready for the discussion as we cover this and much more. You're listening to CUPE Cast, episode 42, Provincial Election and Workers' Democracy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of CUPE Cast. I hope you are doing well and staying safe. Before we start, I just want to do a quick check-in. Mo, how have you been?
Thanks, Brianna. I'm doing well. Uh, Enjoying the snowstorm in Toronto. I was actually just reading about the mass protests that are happening in Belgium.
Hmm.
So it's pretty interesting to see what workers are doing across the globe. So tens of thousands of workers took to the streets, around 60,000 to be exact, in Brussels, and they did so against the new right-wing government and their plans of a series of budget cuts, which will affect pensions, hospital funding, unemployment, etc. Now, these protests have sparked a multi day strike that actually halted air traffic in the country.
Oh.
And this happens even even after the newly elected government has only been in power for just about 10 days, right? So it's pretty interesting to see that workers are not afraid of collisions, and will take on the government across the globe. And it's also pretty daunting to see that the far right is on the rise in different parts of the globe.
Mhm.
And one of the interesting things about this new Flemish nationalist government in Brussels, or in Belgium, is they're planning to increase military spending,
Mhm.
which sounds about right if you take a look into global politics. Increased militarism, and more cuts for the working class and for the poor of society. But maybe that'll be a separate episode for us to talk about. So, yeah,
Sure.
how are you doing, Brianna?
I am doing great. As our listeners may be aware of, February is Black History Month. I just want to start off to say happy Black History Month to all those that are celebrating. With Black History Month, it means that I've been very busy, like in the workplace and in the community, supporting in the workplace Black History Month events for staff. And then my local is also having a Black History Month event coming up that I'm looking to support. And then as well, trying to be more intentional of supporting different Black History Month events that are happening across the city. So it's been a very busy month with Black History Month, but it's been exciting. And so, one thing is for sure, we can say that 2025 started off with excitement. Just to name a few, we have had the threat of tariffs from our neighbors to the south. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has resigned. And very recently, parts of our province has experienced a major snowstorm. Now, myself and Mo are from Toronto, so with this snowstorm, we got a lot of snow, and to the point where we don't know what we're doing with the snow. So it'll be very interesting to see if we get more snow and how we are going to deal with it. These are just some of the issues. But however, the provincial election has been the biggest topic recently, especially those who are involved in labor.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that, Brianna. And, you know, happy Black History Month. So I want to provide some context for our listeners. Our premier of this province of Ontario, uh, Doug Ford, and the Conservative government have decided to take their chances and called for an early election on January 28th. The lieutenant governor signed a proclamation to dissolve the current parliament, initiating the next general election for Thursday, February 27, 2025. Now, I want to point out that Ontario voters were not scheduled to cast their ballots until June 2026. The Ford government still had over a year in power, but decided that it was best to call an election over a year and a half early. So it does call into question why the PC government called a snap election over a year early, and was that even necessary?
That's a great question you asked, and I'm sure our listeners are also wondering why we are going to the polls so early. If you've been involved in the labor movement, a regular listener of CUPE Cast, or at the very least have listened to several episodes in the past year, then the snap election would come to no shock to you. We have hinted several times in 2024 that an election may happen in early 2025. There are several reasons why the PC government called the election early. We'll highlight a few today. Let's start with what's happening in Ottawa. So on January 6, 2025, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that he will be stepping down as Prime Minister. As Trudeau steps down as the Liberal Party leader, this will lead to an extended break for Parliament in Ottawa while the race for a new Liberal Party leader occurs.
So, with the anticipation of a federal election taking place this year, the Ford government has taken full advantage of the break happening in Ottawa. According to a CBC article titled Why Calling an Election Now Helps Doug Ford and His Ontario PCs, the Liberal Party resources are being stretched thin. Volunteers and organizers who would be available to support the Ontario Liberal Party are now being used for the new party leadership race. Also, let's not forget that Ford is looking to secure his spot before the federal election. In the same article, it is mentioned that PC organizers are afraid that if Ford waited until 2026, the PC brand, particularly PC party leader Pierre Poilievre, could create a backlash for the Ontario PC party.
That's very interesting. And another point I want to flag today is timing. So, for our listeners in Ontario, you probably received a $200 check from the provincial government. While it's noted that the $200 check is a taxpayer rebate, it is perfect timing for these checks to just land in our mailbox and for every eligible resident who paid taxes in the previous year to receive it. Just to note that it's been reported that in order to distribute these checks to all the eligible residents in the province, it has cost the province over $3 billion. So, with this happening, what do the other party leaders think? Liberal Party leader Bonnie Crombie has called the checks a pre election bribe. In contrast, NDP leader Merritt Stiles has stated that the $200 check actually does not resolve the affordability crisis that's happening in the province. Green Party leader Mike Schreiner criticized that these checks should have been sent to those struggling to keep up with the cost of living and not all Ontarians. Personally, for me, the $200 check comes and goes very quickly, especially with the cost of groceries these days. It's very expensive, and $200 is just really like a drop in the bucket these days. But what I do want to emphasize is that it cost the province $3 billion to do this, and $3 billion is a lot of money that could have been reinvested into our public services and improving the working conditions for many of our public sector workers.
I'd agree with that.
Mhm.
$200 in Ontario is nothing. Uh, that's you spend that as soon as you walk outside of your door.
I know.
But yeah, since the PCs have taken government in 2018, we have seen a dismantling of our public services and our agencies, such as our healthcare and education sectors, and the privatization of alcohol. Now, that's just to name a few, and we'll touch on a bit of this later in this episode. In the meantime, I want to highlight our third and final point: the tariffs. As we know, in the weeks leading to the writ drop in Ontario, the country was on the brink of facing tariff threats from the Trump administration in the United States. Since the US recently imposed tariffs on Canada, the PC party has used this opportunity to position itself as the savior of the province. Ford stated he needs a new mandate from the people if the PC party plans to spend billions of dollars to protect Ontario from the tariffs.
And we know, go ahead. You wanted to add
Now,
something?
we all understand politics, at least on a surface level. But if you already have a majority government, why, and you already have a mandate, why call for an early election that's going to cost us over $130 million?
I agree. And we know historically the PC government, while being in power, have you know, made decisions without consulting or needing a new mandate from the residents. And some of these examples are like the alcohol expansion. So seeing, the sales of alcohol going into like convenience stores and grocery stores, and the selling of the protected greenbelt to developers. While that has been pulled back, but it's interesting to see, they are able to make these decisions without re-engaging the public or asking for a new mandate. CUPE Ontario's president, Fred Hahn, has stated in a news release that Ford might want to shift attention to Trump's threats, but CUPE members will go to the polls to vote for stronger public services and for a new premier who would deliver honestly for the working Ontarians. Today, we only cover a few of these topics of why the election is happening. But the CBC article does highlight a few more, and we'll make sure to include the link in our show notes if you are curious about the other reasons.
Before moving on, it is worth mentioning what the labor movement thinks about the election, whether they are supporting the PC government. We know that QP does endorse the NDP. As we know, many of the NDP candidates and MPPs, ministers of provincial parliament, were workers and union
Mhm.
members before running for office. Think, for example, of Jill Andrews, Chris Glover, who were
Mm.
QP members, Jamie West, a steelworker, Wayne Gates, an auto worker, and Jennifer French, a teacher. But the question begs itself: what do other unions think?
That is a great question. And to hear the other perspectives from different unions, I'm going to refer to an episode of The Agenda that I recently watched. The episode featured JP Hornick, president of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, also known as OPSU, Karen Brown, president of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, FO, Victoria Mencelli, director of communications at the Laborers International Union of North America, and Jeff Gray, Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. And they came together in this episode to talk about organized labor position in this election. So as I was watching this episode, we see that, some of the unions have actually endorsed the PC party, while other unions have taken the stance of endorsing individual candidates instead of a party. Um, and it was a great conversation to see how unions decide who they would endorse. and the different perspectives and how these perspectives differ between public and private unions. I also find it interesting how the PC government have engaged with some unions, particularly leaning towards more of the private unions, those who have benefited advancing the party's ideals and goals and have neglected others. OPSU and EFO have flagged while he's putting investments into certain sectors such as construction, he has neglected other sectors which other unions support, many whom are helping to keep the province running. So I also liked in this episode how they try to take a look at how the PC party is engaging with unions from an intersectional lens and which unions have better relationships with the PC government and how an intersectional lens play a role into that. While I don't have all the time in the world to like do a full review on the episode, I think it was a great conversation. I do recommend watching it. It's about 30 minutes long. Of course, I will leave a link to the episode in the show notes if you are interested.
These are thanks for that, Brianna. These are pretty interesting times. Um, on that note, I know in the episode that JP and Karen spoke about some of the issues affecting their members, such as chronic underfunding and the expansion of privatization. We now want to shed some light on some issues affecting CUPE members. Brianna and I recently contacted Dr. Carlo Fanelli, an associate professor of work and labor studies in the Department of Social Science and the interim director of the Global Research Center at York University. We asked about his thoughts regarding the current state of the province. Fanelli recently co-edited the book against. It's called "Against the People: How Ford Nation is Dismantling Ontario." This is done obviously in alongside Brian Evans. The book was released earlier this month. In this book, Fanelli and Evans deconstruct the PC party's assault on public services and the impact that is felt by Ontarians.
So when we reach out to Finelli and ask for his thoughts about where we are today, he shared that, quote, no matter how one measures it, most Ontarians today are worse off than when the Ford Conservatives first came into power 7 years ago. In that time, the number of Ontarians without a family doctor rose from 1.5 to 2.5 million. There are 4,400 fewer hospital beds and some 35,000 fewer frontline hospital workers than there would have been. There would have the Ford government just has kept in pace with inflation. 40% of Ontarians today, the highest record and the most in any province, report living in a household that is experiencing financial hardship and they are considering leaving the province due to low wages, rising debt loads, and unaffordable food and rising housing costs. We can look at Finelli's quote and see how it ties back to keeping members, particularly around the work that a lot of our members do and, the people that they serve.
In the first part of his statement, Finelli speaks to the breakdown of the healthcare system. KIPI members who work in the healthcare sector have flagged for years that Bill 124, understaffing, and poor working conditions are driving people away from working in the sector and leaving services at a crisis point. We know that when one cannot access healthcare, it affects our ability to work, and we know the downward spiral that can happen if one cannot work and get financial support. The Ontario Medical Association represents Ontario's 43,000 plus physicians, medical students, and retired physicians. They have launched a campaign called Stop the Crisis, with a call to address the vacancies in the healthcare sector and to call the government to make healthcare accessible to all.
And I also want to note that we are also seeing a rise of private health clinics. So last year, the former co-hosts of CUPE Cast, Brittany and myself, we did an episode on the cost of privatizing healthcare, and we sat down with Tiffany, who was a member of Unifor, who shared her experience navigating the private healthcare system. It's worth a listen to hear her real life testimony about the negative impacts of privatizing our healthcare system. I just wanted to throw that in. So if folks actually need to put the dots together or need an example, we have an episode for you that you can listen to.
Good point. We'll make sure to leave the link to that episode in our show notes. Michael Hurley, president of OCHU CUPE. OCHU is the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions, has faced all these cuts and underfunding, and hospitals across Ontario face a cumulative $2 billion deficit. In response, he said hospitals are reducing costs at the expense of patients, even as staffing levels are falling in the face of growing demand. Leading up to the election, CUPE Ontario called on the Ford government to create a staffing plan premised on fair compensation, good working conditions, and a long term recruitment strategy. CUPE Ontario has demanded the following: ban the use of agency nursing in Ontario's healthcare sector by phasing them out over the next 3 years. In the interim period, CUPE recommends limiting wages of agency staff to within 10% of in house staff, investing in permanent full time healthcare jobs that offer fair compensation, address burnout and unsafe working conditions that are driving staff away, and provide incentives like on site childcare for the predominantly female workforce. And lastly, develop a robust healthcare recruitment strategy to attract talent, with financial incentives for nursing and PSW students and expansion in addition to programs.
So, on top of healthcare, Finelli has also pointed out that a financial crisis is impacting Ontarians day to day. Many households are living in poverty or just one paycheck away from being at the poverty line. We know that financial insecurity impacts the well being of Ontarians and can affect their overall health and well being. Housing costs, just to give a few stats, the housing costs are up by 23%. Homelessness in the province is up by 25%, hitting over 80,000 people, and 1 in 16 people visited a food bank last year. So, the Wellesley Institute recently released an article on its website called Ontario Election Series Ontarians Must Thrive. The article suggests the importance of candidates and political parties putting policies forward that will lift the floor for the most marginalized in our province by looking in a few areas. So, one of the areas the Wellesley Institute highlights is the inadequacy of current social assistance programs, namely the Ontario Disability Support Program, also known as ODSP, and then the Ontario Works, also known as OW, in providing sufficient income for recipients to afford the basic necessities. So the current rates are currently $1,308 a month for ODSP recipients and $733 a month for OW recipients. As we know, I'm going to just speak for the fact that I live in Toronto. To have that once a month is not enough to pay rent, for food, for necessities overall. And I could see why they are saying that amount is far beyond below the poverty line. And we have many CUPE members, and I'm going to say as well, like members in my own local who support clients who are on ODSP and OW. And with the rising cost of goods and services, it actually makes it a lot harder for those on ODSP and OW to live healthy lives. And it also makes it harder for our workers to support them.
I know workers have shared this concern and passed many
Mhm.
resolutions at QP Ontario conventions to bring this issue to the forefront. Many of our members, QP members, understand firsthand these challenges that the recipients face and the challenges of adequately providing support for recipients as more services are being underfunded and cut. Finelli agrees and shares, quote, worker incomes have barely budged since 2018, while Ontario Works, ODSP, and social assistance rates are lower today in real terms than when the Ford conservatives first came to power. I
Hmm.
mean, this is, Finelli sums it up pretty well,
Yeah,
but this is not new. We've all seen it, we've all spoken about it, and I'm hoping that I'm hoping that we have a real awakening in Ontario.
I agree. And, another point that I want to bring up is the lack of funding in our education system. So when we asked Finelli this, Finelli shared that, quote, Ontario sits dead last among the provinces when it comes to operating supports for post secondary education and some 35% below the Canadian student average. The same is true for our elementary and secondary schools, where had investments grown equal to Ontario's population growth, there would be an additional 5,000 frontline classroom work educators. As a result, educational institutions across Ontario have resorted to a record number of program closures, staff and faculty layoffs, and the growing number of repair backlogs, while students bear the brunt of larger classroom sizes and fewer supports, end quote. CUPE Ontario recently surveyed over 12,000 school board workers, which reinforces Finelli's point about some of the issues that are happening in our education system.
So, in a news release about the survey results, the president of OSBCU, Joe Tigani, said, and I quote, "It is abundantly clear that the education system in Ontario is at a breaking point. For years, the Conservative government has continued to cut billions of dollars in funding to the education sector, causing extreme understaffing, increased violence against staff and students, and our students' needs being neglected. There's no question that the Ford government has abandoned the education sector. The Ontario government must increase its investment in students and education workers and address the situation immediately. Students deserve better, parents deserve better, and our education workers deserve better." Unquote.
Is Ain't that the truth? For sure. And Mo and myself, we just highlighted some of the issues that are affecting the working class, our QP members, and the public. But we know that in today's episode, we haven't touched on all the issues. There are a lot more that could be discussed. But if you're interested in getting insights from QP workers across different sectors, I would recommend checking out qpvotes.ca. So this is a website launched by QP Ontario. It's a great resource to highlight some of the failures of the PC government and how it affects QP workers. I will leave a link to that page in our show notes. Definitely worth watching because they do videos featuring a lot of the workers as well, giving their perspective and their insights into what's happening in their workplace.
As you get ready to head to the polls, is there anything that is important to you, Brianna?
Thanks for asking. So I know we touched on what's happening generally for workers. But, although Mo and myself, we are both QP members, it is also still important to remember that we are also residents of this province as well. And there are some things that personally might impact us. So for me personally, I think what is on top of mind for me is transportation. I, as our listeners know, I live in Toronto. I take public transportation, and public transportation is should be invested a lot more in the city of Toronto, especially as the city continues to grow. We've also seen delays in the opening of a lot of our new lines, which is being kind of like overseen by the provincial agency Metrolinx. And with that kind of delay and the partnership and going back and forth, it is impacting communities that, the construction is taking place. And just for like the residents who might rely on the opening of these new transit lines to take it to get travel throughout the city. I think that's one. I think healthcare is another one that's important to me. As I slowly get older, And as family members also do get older as well, it's something that comes to top of mind of like, if something should happen, not saying something is happening, but if something should happen, would myself or will my loved ones be properly taken care of through the healthcare system? So that's also something important to me. And then the last thing that's also important to me, I don't have children yet, but I have nieces and nephews, and schooling is very important to me. Like, I would want to ensure that, wherever my niece and nephews go to school, that they are in a safe building, the environment's safe, it's the workers feel safe. So, although I'm not a parent, I do think about like the next generation in my family, and as they navigate through the school system, are they actually being supported? Are they learning in a safe environment? Those are kind of some of the things that I grapple with as I'm thinking about this election. How about you, Mo?
I mean, you pretty much summed it up, I think, for all of us. So I'm not sure what I can talk about, but I would say all of it. I mean,
Okay.
living in the province for a while and seeing how a lot of our social services and our public services have really spiraled down due
Yeah.
due to government negligence and government undercutting and understaffing. It's wild, and I don't think there's one single thing that I would say is the pinnacle issue. I
Mm-hmm.
think all of them matter. Um, for me, I would really like to see a reckoning across the province and across the country. I think workers, us trade unionists, have to begin thinking of how do we completely take power
Yeah.
in terms of forming and taking and forming government. Um, and I don't think it's a one um, election cycle issue. But anyway, that's my own 2 cents. I'm responsible for my own personal beliefs. But Brianna, in the June 2022 election, we saw a record low voter turnout
Yeah.
or turnaround, with only about 43% of eligible voters exercising their right to vote. As you are personally heading to the polls, do you want to talk about why it's important for Ontarians to go out and vote?
Yeah. So that number is low, very low. I recently seen on, I believe it was Instagram, where it was just this is me going on a little bit of a rant, but a diagram of like the percentages of people who did not vote and then people who did vote, like the breakdown between the parties. And so, like, if non-voters was a party, the non-voters would have won. Let's put that into perspective. Um, so when we are talking about, why is it important to vote, like the government are making decisions that are affecting our livelihoods. And this is my personal belief, like the higher the number of people, eligible voters who vote, it's more reflective of the government that we have voted for that's at Queen's Park. So, when beg the question why people are not participating, why people are not voting, I looked to a TVO article that was written by Nan Kim Wanua, sorry, I mispronounced her name, who analyzes the low voter turnout in Ontario. So in this article, she highlights the lack of trust and how that seems to be a key factor. But she positions the article, instead of blaming the voters, she suggests that we should be looking at those who benefit from voter apathy, and why are we not addressing the systemic issues affecting low voter turnout. So in this article, she states, quote, to address the roots of apathy, there would have to be an action. And it seems much easier to pass the blame than to address the issue of why voters are disengaged from their civic responsibility. Also, let's call to like fact or call out that, calling an election in the middle of the winter will not help out, the low voter turnout.
Yeah, total agreement here.
Mhm.
Actually, the last time this province had an election in February was in 1883. Yep.
We
We
weren't a
weren't a
pod.
pod. Yep. So I think all CUPE members wouldn't have been in existence at that point. Uh, so the day that Brianna and myself record this episode follows the tail end of a massive winter storm.
Hmm.
Imagine having to vote on a day that we've had a few days ago, where most of the streets of a city like Toronto, with a massive population, are most of the streets are covered in snow, and you're not able to get to where you're supposed to get. Now, how would that work for the voters and those working at the polls?
Yeah. So I know in the middle of the storm, like a lot of the services shut down. So like the libraries weren't open, a lot of community centers weren't open or closed early. It would be very difficult. And I know even part of our transit system was shut down. I remember looking outside and like the local bus that I would see for most of the day during the storm, I did not see it until like the storm kind of died down in the evening. So like they rerouted a lot of the buses, and I've heard like the subway was also down. So imagining like in the middle of the storm having to go out and vote, it would be very hard. I personally would go out because I know like the polling station that I'm assigned to like vote at is super close to my house in walking distance. But I could imagine those who it's not so close. It's not like a 5 minute walk or a 2 minute walk. Like you got to walk 10, 15, 20 minutes. That's far. And in a storm, it might deter people. And then would also the folks who are supposed to work the polls, would they be able to even show up with transit being down or transit being delayed? It would just be a huge mess. I don't know if like the election would just have to be postponed. I don't know if they can, but in a day like that, I would just find it super challenging for Ontarians to actually vote, especially in the middle of a winter storm. So, as the author suggests in the article, and as we touched throughout the episode, Ontarians can't get a doctor, can't afford groceries, let alone a place to live. So, if no party has convinced them that, they'll improve their day to day lives, can we blame them for not taking the time to vote?
Honestly, no. I mean, look, as far as elections go, we can't really blame them. We know there's too much at stake if there's a low voter turnout and another majority Tory or PC government uh, comes into power. Now, I want to share something that Dr. Fanelli shared with us. And I quote: "Since the Ford government has come to power, Ontario is more clearly divided between those who must work longer and harder and those who live off the work of others, even Scotiabank and BMO. Like former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz, have recently come to the conclusion that historically unprecedented profit margins have largely driven inflation and out of control costs. 4 more years of Ford will ensure these trends not only continue but get worse. Given everything that is at stake, it's up to workers everywhere to demand more from their employers and governments. Whatever the result of the next election, it's never been more important to organize, educate, and mobilize." Now, that unquote, but that's a really good perspective to have,
Yeah,
because whether at the end of the day, whether there is a PC government or not, us as labor institutions and as workers organizations will always have to be organized and ready to push for our demands.
I agree. And so at QP Ontario's understanding the stakes of having another majority PC government and how it would impact the workers' ability to not only provide for themselves and their families, but also for the public that they often serve. So that's why CUPE Ontario has been taking a proactive stance or taking steps to educate its members about the election and pushing the members to think about a more progressive change in this province. And so this includes launching the Fire Forward campaign, which I don't know if our listeners have seen the video on social media or online. It features a Ford like character, someone who shrinks at accountability, relies on costly gimmicks, and ignores the warnings from the workers who help to keep this province running.
When we asked about the objective of the campaign, CUPE Ontario's Secretary Treasurer, Yolanda McLean, said in a news release, quote, Doug Ford wants to make this election about anything but his own record of failure. But workers aren't falling for it. We're focused on Ford's blame and bribes playbook. The same tactics he used to attack public services, give away healthcare to profit taking CEOs, and greenlight luxury developments instead of affordable housing, leaving Ontario to deal with the lowest housing starts in 69 years. Unquote.
And for listeners who may not be affiliated with CUPE Ontario, you can also check out the Ontario Federation of Labor's Ford Tracker, which will help the voter keep track of all the cuts the PC government have made during its time in power. And this is issue based. So you can search different cuts based on the issues that matter to you. We'll leave the links to the Fired Ford campaign and the Ford Tracker in our show notes. Just before we move on from this point, just want to note that on the Fired Ford campaign, there is a petition. If you'd like to sign, you're always welcome and encouraged to sign it.
Yeah, as we're getting ready to wrap up this episode, I just want our listeners to know if you need more information about the upcoming election, including who the candidates running in your riding are, uh, eligibility to vote, or how to register to vote, I encourage you to visit elections.on.ca. When you also go vote, don't go alone. Encourage your friends, family members, and neighbors to vote all well. At the end of the day, whichever party forms government, we must continue to mobilize and organize, uh, not only for us as workers or as trade unionists, but also for our communities.
That is true. And so I want to close out with something that FO President Karen Brown said in the episode of The Agenda, which we talked about earlier. This actually resonated with me, so I just want to share it with our listeners. She said, quote, "We need to look at the bigger picture. We need to look at the platform of the NDP, look at the platforms of the Liberals, look at the platform of the Green Party, but also the platform of the Progressive Conservatives. Who is looking at things like healthcare, housing, affordable housing, education, things that are important to you and important to build a strong Ontario? And what has been the track record of these governments towards making that happen? Our union members need to be looking at not just their own working environment because we don't live in silos, um, but the impact of our neighbors and everyone else." End quote.
That's a pretty nice quote.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I hope our listeners take that into consideration when they are going to the polls and voting at the end of this month. On that note, I think this is a good spot to wrap up our episode. We want to thank Dr. Carlo Fanelli for sharing his thoughts with us and allowing us to share his perspectives on our on our episode. If you are interested in his work, we'll leave a link to his website in our show notes.
Yeah, and I also want to share an interview I started listening with his co-author Brian Evans. This is a podcast interview he did with Desmond Cole. So it's around the promotion of the book, but the episode does take a deep dive into the book and some of the thoughts around the PC government, the years of austerity, and the impact on Ontarians, and how it's impacting the working class. So I will also leave a link to that podcast episode in the show notes in case folks want to learn more about the book before purchasing it.
Yeah, on a personal note, I would also encourage all of our listeners to take a look into workers' uprisings and workers' revolutions, particularly examples from the global south. You can keep in mind what's happening right now in Belgium, but elections are not our only tool as workers, and we need to keep that in mind. Of course, elections matter for our context here in North America. It's a reality that we have to contend with. But at the end of the day, having a workers' government, or a government by the workers and for the workers, is what we should strive for. And I think there's a lot for us to learn in terms of political uprisings and social revolutions. But that's just my personal 2 cents on it. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning into episode 42 of the CUPE Cast, Provincial Election and Workers' Democracy.
This episode was written and researched by us, Mo and Brianna. We also want to take a moment to thank all the CUPE Ontario staff involved in this episode. Without them, this podcast will not exist. If you have future podcast ideas, you could always email us at cupecast at cupe.on.ca. That is CUPECAST at cupe.on.ca. We also want to thank our friend Mohammed Akbar for being the edit master. This podcast will not sound as great as it does without his talents. And then before we close out, we want to thank you, our incredible listeners, for tuning in to today's episode of CUPE Cast. Please continue to look out for us anywhere you stream or download podcasts, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the CUPE Ontario's website. Please follow and subscribe to CUPE Cast. And if you listen to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, write us a review, leave us a message, let us know what you thought about today's episode. We also encourage you to share this link with your friends and fellow members in your local and unions. Our show notes will have tons of information, especially as we're leading up to the election. We encourage you to check out these links and share these links with whoever you can, especially around informing and educating yourself about the upcoming election. Thank you once again for listening. Sending solidarity.